It was supposed to be just another visit to a prestigious hotel, a stopover to unwind after a grueling week of meetings, a moment of peace in a world that often felt like a whirlwind of business deals, charity events, and global influence. But for Jason Harris, a self-made billionaire from humble beginnings, this visit would be anything but ordinary. The grandeur of the hotel, nestled on the edge of the city's elite district, gleamed like a beacon of wealth and power, attracting only the most affluent and exclusive guests. As Jason stepped out of his sleek black SUV, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit, he felt a strange mix of anticipation and confidence. This wasn't just any hotel, this was an institution of luxury, a place where exclusivity was woven into its very fabric. Jason had earned his place among the world's top businessmen, but there was something about this hotel that had always rubbed him the wrong way. His own experiences in the industry had shown him time and again how power often relied on exclusion, not inclusion. As he entered the hotel's polished lobby, the marble floors gleamed beneath his polished shoes, and the smell of expensive perfume and freshly pressed linens filled the air. The receptionist, a young woman with a stiff smile, greeted him immediately, but her eyes narrowed slightly as she checked his name on the list. There was a moment of tension, one that went unnoticed by the few scattered guests admiring the hotel's art pieces, but Jason felt it. The woman hesitated, then spoke in a tone that seemed just a bit too rehearsed. "Mr. Harris, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. We do not have your reservation." Jason furrowed his brow. "There must be some mistake," he replied calmly. "I made the reservation myself, and I'm certain it was confirmed." Her smile didn't falter, but there was a coldness in her eyes. "I'm afraid the reservation system shows no such record under your name, Mr. Harris. Perhaps you've confused us with another hotel?" Jason's mind raced. It didn't make sense. His assistant had personally secured the reservation weeks ago, and Jason was no stranger to such establishments. He'd been to the finest hotels in the world, walked the same halls as billionaires, politicians, and celebrities. Yet here he was, being told that his reservation simply didn't exist. There was something far more insidious at play, a subtle, unspoken form of discrimination that, while not overt, hung thick in the air. Jason's gut told him that the issue wasn't one of bureaucracy or mistake, it was a matter of race. "Are you saying that my name isn't good enough for your hotel?" Jason's voice was steady, but his mind was beginning to boil with anger. The receptionist's smile wavered for a brief moment, but she quickly recovered, her gaze shifting just slightly to the hotel manager, a tall, well-dressed man who had appeared behind her. His presence, commanding and unyielding, told Jason everything he needed to know. The manager's glance flicked over to him with a practiced indifference, as if to say, "I'm in charge here." "We are terribly sorry for the inconvenience, Mr. Harris," the manager said, his voice smooth but patronizing. "Unfortunately, our hotel is currently at capacity, and we cannot accommodate you tonight. We would be happy to assist you in finding another nearby hotel." Jason was taken aback. There was no way this hotel, one of the most exclusive and expensive in the city, was at capacity. It was a tactic he'd seen before, one designed to humiliate and exclude. The manager's attempt to smooth over the situation with words felt hollow. Jason could see it in his eyes, the subtle judgment, the silent dismissal. Jason's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his composure. He refused to let the obvious slight get the best of him, at least not here, not in front of these strangers. He smiled thinly, his voice laced with quiet fury. "No, thank you. I'll make arrangements elsewhere." His decision was made in that moment. This hotel would not get away with treating him like this. As he turned to leave, he noticed a few heads turning, some curious, some uncertain. The scene, though quiet, felt charged with the weight of 1,000 unspoken prejudices. Jason walked through the lobby, his footsteps echoing off the walls. He didn't look back. Outside, the evening air was crisp, but the warmth of his anger still burned in his chest. He got into the back of the car and instructed the driver to take him home. But as the car sped through the city, his mind was already plotting, his thoughts racing faster than the vehicle itself. This hotel, and the people who ran it, had just made a mistake, one that they would soon regret. Jason's reputation wasn't built on letting insults go unchallenged. He had fought for every inch of success, and he wasn't about to let a group of privileged elites dismiss him without consequences.
He had built his fortune from the ground up, battling prejudice, systemic racism, and bias every step of the way. This wasn't just about a hotel. It was about something much bigger, a message that needed to be sent, loud and clear. As the car pulled up to his mansion, Jason sat still for a moment, deep in thought. He wasn't just going to walk away from this incident. No, he would make them see what it meant to turn away someone like him, someone who had earned his place in the world. The power to change things was within his grasp. It was time to strike back, quietly, strategically, and when the moment was right. The old world of exclusivity and prejudice was about to be shaken to its core. And Jason Harris, the black billionaire who was rejected at the door, was going to be the one to do it. This wouldn't be the end of the story. It would be the beginning of a new chapter, one that would leave an indelible mark on the city, on the hotel, and on everyone who had ever doubted him. But first, he needed to build the plan that would change everything. And as he stood in the foyer of his mansion, the quiet hum of the city outside, he knew this wasn't just about revenge. This was about rewriting the rules. The fight had just begun. Jason spent the next few days in a haze of thought, his mind focused on a singular goal. He didn't tell anyone what had happened at the hotel, not his business partners, not even his closest friends. He knew that if he spoke about it too soon, it might seem petty or rash. But as the hours stretched into days, the sting of that rejection only grew sharper. It wasn't the refusal that angered him the most, it was the cold, calculated way it had been done. The way the staff had turned him away with barely a second glance, as if his presence didn't matter in their world. It wasn't about race in their eyes, it was about power. And Jason Harris, despite his fortune, was a reminder that the old order was being challenged. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that his anger wasn't just about personal humiliation. It was about the message that this hotel, and places like it, sent to the world. That wealth and privilege could be hoarded behind closed doors, behind the smokescreen of exclusivity, leaving so many people like him, like his father, like his community, out in the cold. He had spent his life fighting for respect, fighting for equality, fighting for a seat at the table where decisions were made. But what if the seat at the table wasn't enough anymore? What if the table itself needed to be torn down and rebuilt? Jason turned to his closest advisors, though he kept the exact nature of his plan to himself. He gathered them for what he called a business strategy meeting, but it wasn't about business in the traditional sense. The goal was more personal than that. He needed to know who owned the hotel, what it took to purchase it, and how he could do so without drawing too much attention too quickly. His legal team dove into the research, uncovering the tangled web of ownership and financial backers. The hotel, as it turned out, had a long history of discrimination. It wasn't just the refusal of black patrons, it was a systemic issue, woven into the very fabric of its operations. The owners were old money, families whose names had been tied to the hotel since its founding decades ago. The deeper Jason dug, the more the layers of corruption and prejudice became apparent. There were rumors of shady dealings, of underhanded business practices designed to keep the hotel a bastion of old-world elitism. Jason's pulse quickened with a mix of fury and excitement. This wasn't just about one hotel, it was about a system, a mindset that needed to be broken. What better way to shake the foundation of that power than to own the very thing that had rejected him? But buying the hotel would not be simple. Jason knew that. It was a massive undertaking. The hotel's owners had built an empire around it, and no one had ever seriously challenged their control. Jason had resources, he was one of the wealthiest men in the world, after all, but money wasn't the only barrier here. It was about influence, connections, and the silent networks that operated just beneath the surface. As much as he wanted to act swiftly, he needed to be careful. The wrong move could tip his hand, could make it clear that he was after something far more profound than just a place to stay. Over the next few weeks, Jason's life became a series of strategic moves and clandestine meetings. His legal team scoured financial records, tracing the ownership back through shell companies and holding firms. His PR team began laying the groundwork for the public response, shaping the narrative to ensure that no matter what happened, Jason's actions would be framed as part of a larger fight for equality and justice. He hired a group of private investigators to follow the key players in the hotel's management, uncovering any dirt they could find, financial irregularities, personal scandals, anything that could be used to his advantage. But even as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Jason felt the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He had faced challenges before, deals that had fallen through, rivals who tried to sabotage his success, but this felt different. This was personal. This was about changing the narrative, about forcing the powerful to reckon with the fact that they couldn't hide behind their wealth and exclusivity anymore. It wasn't just about buying a hotel. It was about dismantling the structures of power that kept people like him, and so many others, out of sight, out of mind. The emotional toll was heavy. Jason's wife, Maria, began to notice the change in him. She had always been supportive, but the late nights, the obsessive focus, the subtle distance that had crept into their relationship, it was starting to worry her. "You've always been driven, Jason, but this feels different," she said one evening, her voice soft but concerned. "You're not just trying to win, you're trying to prove something." To who? Jason hadn't known how to answer her at first. His instinct was to brush it off, to tell her that it was just another business deal, just another challenge to overcome. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the whole truth. This was more than business. This was about legacy. About showing the world that he was no longer going to be pushed aside, that no one could take what was rightfully his. He owed it to his father, who had worked countless hours in factories and endured prejudice his entire life without ever having the chance to fight back. He owed it to his community, who had watched him rise and believed that maybe, just maybe, they could rise with him. "I'm doing this for more than just me, Maria," Jason finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm doing this for everyone who's ever been told they didn't belong. For everyone who's ever been turned away, left out, ignored. I can't just let this go." She sighed, a mix of frustration and understanding in her eyes. "I just don't want to see you lose yourself in this fight. I want you to win, Jason, but not at the cost of everything else." Jason promised her that he would be careful, but deep down, he knew the stakes were too high for caution now. He was already too far in. As the weeks passed, Jason moved closer to his goal. He made a strategic offer to purchase a significant stake in the hotel, carefully crafting a pitch that would make it impossible for the owners to turn down. But just as he was preparing to send in the final offer, he received a call from a trusted source within the hotel's board of directors. "We know what you're trying to do," the voice said, the words deliberate and cold. "And if you think we're going to let you take what's ours, you're wrong. This hotel belongs to us, not to some outsider trying to make a point." Jason's jaw tightened. He had expected resistance, but not this direct a challenge. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the tipping point. He wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to be intimidated. "I'll see you in court," Jason said, his voice a calm fury. "And when this is over, you'll wish you had never crossed me." The line went silent, and Jason hung up, staring out the window. The battle had just begun, and he knew that there was no turning back now. He wasn't just fighting for a hotel anymore. He was fighting for the future, for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And he was going to win. The legal battle began almost immediately after Jason's final, defiant phone call. It was a fight that would stretch across months, a war fought in boardrooms and courtrooms, with every legal maneuver and tactical move playing out like a high-stakes chess match. Jason's legal team worked around the clock, uncovering every shred of evidence they could find to support their case. They dug into the hotel's financial records, scrutinized every possible legal loophole, and even began contacting former employees who had worked under the current management. What they discovered sent a chill down Jason's spine. The hotel, far from being the pillar of luxury and exclusivity it presented itself to be, was built on a series of ethically questionable dealings. They had used discriminatory practices to maintain their reputation, systematically excluding black patrons and other minorities, not just in their guest lists but in their hiring practices, their advertising, and their policies. Jason's attorneys saw it as a clear violation of civil rights, an illegal act of discrimination masked by wealth and privilege. It was more than just about him, it was about holding this institution accountable for years of exclusion, of perpetuating a system that kept wealth and power consolidated in the hands of the few. But the opposition was just as relentless. The hotel's owners, though old and entrenched in their ways, had an arsenal of resources at their disposal. They had hired some of the best lawyers in the country, men and women who had defended the interests of the rich and powerful for decades. Jason wasn't the first person to challenge them, but he was the first to do so with such fire and such a personal stake in the outcome. Every document that Jason's team filed was met with counter-arguments. Every press release Jason sent out calling for accountability was met with an onslaught of public relations campaigns designed to paint him as a disgruntled billionaire with an axe to grind. The media spun his fight in all sorts of directions, some sympathetic, but many others suggesting that Jason was trying to ruin the reputation of a long-standing institution simply because his pride had been wounded. It was a narrative that Jason knew all too well, the story of a black man who had risen to success but was still somehow considered unworthy, still somehow seen as the outsider, no matter how much money he had. Despite the pressure, Jason refused to back down. Every time the hotel tried to dismiss him, every time they attempted to undermine his cause, he pushed back harder. He held press conferences, spoke at rallies, and appeared on news outlets, highlighting the systemic racism that continued to run through the veins of the establishment. He made sure that the world knew what was at stake. He made sure that people understood that this wasn't just about one hotel. It was about changing the status quo, about opening the doors of opportunity to people who had been excluded for far too long. His words struck a chord with many, especially in the city, where racial tensions had long simmered beneath the surface. Protests grew outside the hotel, demanding justice and equality, and Jason found himself at the forefront of a movement he hadn't expected but now couldn't walk away from. His actions had sparked something much larger than he had ever anticipated. The fight had become symbolic, a battle not just for a hotel, but for the dignity of those who had been marginalized for far too long. But as much as Jason reveled in the growing support, he knew the road ahead would not be easy. The owners of the hotel had deep pockets, powerful friends, and an army of lawyers who would stop at nothing to protect their legacy. Jason knew this would be a battle of attrition, one that would test his resolve, his resources, and his patience. As the months dragged on, the stress began to take its toll on him. Long nights in the office, endless meetings, and constant strategizing began to erode his energy. The physical strain was starting to show. He had trouble sleeping, and his appetite had diminished. His once pristine suit jackets now seemed to sag on him, and his energy, once boundless, seemed to flicker out like a dying flame. But it wasn't just the physical toll, there was the emotional weight of the fight as well. The constant pressure, the weight of every decision, the endless scrutiny, it was wearing him down. And the worst part was that there were moments when he began to question himself. Was this fight really worth it? What would he accomplish if he won? Even if he took ownership of the hotel, would it make a difference in the long run? The doubts crept in when he was alone in the quiet hours of the night, and he often found himself wrestling with them in silence. But it was during one of those sleepless nights that Jason's perspective shifted. He was alone in his office, surrounded by paperwork, his mind a whirlwind of legal jargon and strategy. He glanced up at the picture on the wall, a photo of his father from when he was a young man, hard-working, full of dreams, but always standing up against the injustices he saw. Jason remembered the sacrifices his father had made to ensure that he could have opportunities that he never had. He remembered the struggles, the quiet nights when his father had worked 2 or 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. His father's face, weathered but proud, stared back at him from the frame. Jason suddenly felt a surge of determination. This fight wasn't about a hotel. This fight was about everything his father had fought for, everything his family had sacrificed for. It was about ensuring that the world didn't just hand out scraps, but that everyone, no matter where they came from, had a chance to build their own future, to carve out their own destiny. Jason wiped away the doubts and steeled himself. He wasn't in this for a quick victory, and he wasn't in this for personal glory. This was about something bigger, something that would echo far beyond the walls of this hotel. He had made it this far, and there was no turning back now. As the legal battle continued, a new element was introduced to the equation: Jason's business rival, Maxwell Harrington. Maxwell had always been a thorn in Jason's side, an arrogant, powerful man who had built his own empire on the back of ruthless deals and shady alliances. Maxwell saw the hotel's plight as an opportunity to further his own business interests, and he entered the fray with an offer to buy out the hotel's owners outright. He wasn't interested in justice, or in any moral cause, he was interested in control. Jason knew that Maxwell was a dangerous man, and his involvement complicated things. It was no longer just about the hotel or its owners, it was about keeping the power out of the wrong hands. Jason couldn't let someone like Maxwell control the outcome of this fight. Now, the battle had escalated. It was no longer just about proving a point, it was about survival. Maxwell's entrance into the picture added an unexpected layer of urgency to Jason's plans. The stakes were higher than ever, and if he didn't act swiftly, everything he had worked for could be taken from him. It was no longer just a battle for the hotel, it was a battle for the future itself. And Jason Harris was more determined than ever to win. The battle for control of the hotel had reached a boiling point. Jason could feel the tension in the air. Maxwell Harrington's presence loomed over every decision, every move. He was relentless, a man who had made a name for himself by seizing opportunities without hesitation, no matter the cost. Jason knew that Maxwell would stop at nothing to buy the hotel out from under him, but it wasn't just about the hotel anymore. It was about proving that someone like him, a black man with a vision, could disrupt the old system of power that had long dominated the city. Jason's strategy was no longer just about legal maneuvering or public relations. It was about securing his place in the city's future, about redefining what success meant in a world that had long turned a blind eye to people like him. Maxwell had always been the symbol of that world, privileged, ruthless, and willing to bend the rules to fit his needs. Jason couldn't let him win, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been marginalized, ignored, or discarded by the system that Maxwell represented. As the legal proceedings dragged on, the pressure intensified. The media continued to cover the saga, with some outlets rallying behind Jason, while others painted him as a threat to the city's legacy of exclusivity. But Jason didn't care about the headlines anymore. He'd already decided that this was about more than just the hotel, it was about changing the course of history, about showing that the future of power in this city didn't belong to men like Maxwell Harrington. It belonged to those who had fought, struggled, and clawed their way to the top, despite being told they didn't belong there. The hotel's owners, though reluctant, began to entertain the possibility of selling to Jason. They were caught between two forces, the old guard that had kept the hotel a symbol of their legacy, and the new wave of change that Jason represented. The offer he made was strategic and bold. Jason didn't just want the hotel, he wanted a seat at the table. He proposed a deal that would ensure the community had a voice in the hotel's future, a space where diversity, inclusion, and innovation would thrive. It was a plan that no one had seen coming, and it put the hotel's owners in a difficult position. Maxwell, seeing the momentum building behind Jason, began to panic. He wasn't accustomed to losing control, and the thought of someone like Jason Harris taking over a symbol of the old guard's power was unbearable to him. So, he began to play dirty. He used his influence to push for a smear campaign, targeting Jason's character and business practices, trying to paint him as an opportunist and a danger to the city's future. He leaked false information to the press, accusing Jason of using underhanded tactics to force a deal. But Jason was prepared for this. He had anticipated Maxwell's every move and responded with transparency and poise. He invited the media into his world, showing them who he really was, not just a businessman, but a man committed to making real change. In the meantime, the city was watching. Protests outside the hotel continued, but they had shifted in tone. No longer were they simply about the wrongs of the past, they were about the possibility of a better future. Jason was no longer just fighting for himself, he was fighting for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong in the rooms of power. The city's residents, many of whom had lived under the shadow of systemic inequality, rallied behind him. They saw in him not just a man with money, but a symbol of hope, someone who had used his success to challenge the status quo and demand that the doors of power be opened to everyone. As the legal proceedings pressed forward, Jason began to see the cracks in Maxwell's empire. The smear campaign had backfired, and Maxwell's reputation, which had once seemed untouchable, was beginning to tarnish. His underhanded tactics and willingness to manipulate the truth were exposed. Jason's team found evidence that Maxwell had been involved in questionable dealings of his own, using his influence to manipulate land deals and secure favorable business contracts that benefited only a small group of wealthy individuals. The revelation sent shockwaves through the business community. Maxwell had always been seen as a champion of the elite, but now he was beginning to be viewed as the very kind of corrupt power that Jason had been fighting against all along. The more Jason uncovered, the more he realized how deep the corruption ran, not just in the hotel industry, but in the very foundations of the city itself. The old guard had built their wealth and influence on the backs of others, and now they were desperate to keep it. But Jason wasn't backing down. He had built his empire on his own terms, and he wasn't about to let anyone, or anything, stand in his way. The final battle took place in the courtroom. The pressure had reached its peak, with both sides laying out their arguments before a judge who would ultimately decide the fate of the hotel. Maxwell's lawyers were confident, they had been down this road before, and they believed they could bury Jason's case with legal jargon and technicalities. But Jason's team had something Maxwell couldn't counter, the truth. They presented their case with a relentless clarity, showing not just the hotel's discriminatory practices, but the deep-rooted issues in the city's business culture. They brought in witnesses, former employees, business owners, and community leaders, all of whom testified to the harm done by the hotel's exclusionary policies. And then came Jason's turn. He stood in front of the court, calm and collected, but with fire in his eyes. He spoke not just about the hotel or the money, it was about the future, about the legacy he wanted to leave behind. "This isn't just about ownership," he said, his voice ringing through the courtroom. "This is about ensuring that people like me, people like my father, people from communities that have been ignored and excluded for far too long, have a place at the table. This is about breaking down the walls that have been built to keep us out, and building something new, something that we can all be a part of. I didn't fight my way to the top just to sit at a table that doesn't want me there. I'm here to build a new table, one where everyone has a seat." The words resonated deeply with the judge, with the jury, and with the many people who had been watching the trial unfold. It wasn't just a business deal anymore. It was a movement, a moment in history when a man had taken a stand and refused to accept the old order. The judge deliberated for what seemed like an eternity, and when the decision finally came, it was clear. Jason was granted the right to purchase the hotel. Not only that, but the judge ruled that the owners had violated several discrimination laws and had to pay damages. The victory was sweet, but it wasn't about the money. It wasn't about owning a hotel. It was about making history. Jason had broken through the walls of exclusion, and now, he was in control of the very thing that had once turned him away. He had proven that change was possible, that a man who had been denied could rise and rewrite the rules. The hotel wasn't just a place to stay, it was a symbol of a new era, one where power, success, and opportunity were no longer reserved for the few. And as Jason stood outside the hotel, the weight of the moment settled on him. This wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. It was a victory for the future. The decision to purchase the hotel was just the beginning. Though Jason had won the legal battle, the real work had only just begun. As he stepped into the lobby of the once exclusive establishment, now legally his, the weight of responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders. The place that had once rejected him, that had stood as a symbol of everything he had fought against, now lay in his hands. But he wasn't just going to sit back and count his victory, he had big plans for what the hotel could become. The next few months would be a blur of decisions, consultations, and transformations. Jason wasn't merely interested in running a luxury hotel. He saw this as an opportunity to flip the script on an industry that had long been controlled by a powerful, predominantly white elite. He envisioned a space that was as inclusive as it was luxurious, a place where anyone, regardless of their race, background, or status, could feel welcome and valued. Jason's first step was to overhaul the hotel staff. He wasn't going to let the same exclusionary policies persist under his ownership. He brought in experts in diversity and inclusion, restructured the hiring process to ensure that people from all walks of life had a fair shot at employment, and, most importantly, he placed a priority on hiring people from the local community. The hotel's new mission was to not only be a hub for luxury and hospitality, but a place that reflected the vibrancy and diversity of the city itself. He brought in chefs from different cultural backgrounds, artists to decorate the walls with a variety of perspectives, and performers who represented the many voices of the community. The once stuffy, exclusive hotel was transformed into a bustling cultural center, where events and exhibitions celebrating the city's diverse population were held regularly. Jason had reimagined what success could look like. It wasn't just about the wealth it brought in, it was about the impact it could have on the community. But change of this magnitude didn't come without resistance. There were those, especially in the old guard, who saw Jason's vision as a betrayal. They thought he had been granted the keys to their kingdom only to turn it into something unrecognizable, something that no longer served the interests of the elite. The hotel's former owners, some of whom still had influential ties in the city, attempted to rally against him, using their connections to criticize his decisions in the press. They portrayed Jason as someone who was ruining a fine institution, someone who was prioritizing politics over business. But Jason knew that the most important business decision he had made was to align himself with values that reflected the world as it was now, not as it had been decades ago. He remained undeterred, pushing forward with the plan he believed in, no matter the criticisms. In the midst of the renovations and community outreach, Jason also took steps to address the long-standing damage caused by the hotel's past practices. He set up a scholarship fund to support local youth, particularly those from marginalized communities, to pursue careers in hospitality and business. He created mentorship programs to help young entrepreneurs find their footing, offering them a platform to grow and succeed in industries that had been closed off to many. For Jason, the hotel wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a springboard for the next generation. He knew that the success of the business wasn't just measured in profits, it was about what he could give back to the people who had helped him along the way, and to those who had never been given a chance in the first place. As the months passed, the hotel's transformation began to make waves. It was no longer just a business, it had become a symbol. Tourists from all over the world now visited not only for its luxurious accommodations, but for the story behind it. They wanted to experience the place that had once shut its doors to a man and had now become a beacon of change. The media, once skeptical, now reported on the hotel's success and its new mission. Jason was invited to speak at conferences and forums about leadership, diversity, and the power of inclusion in business. He became a sought-after figure, not just because of his wealth, but because of the way he had used his resources to create something bigger than himself. However, even as Jason basked in the success of his transformation, there were moments when the enormity of what he had accomplished hit him. The long nights, the endless meetings, the moments of doubt and exhaustion, he had pushed through them all, but now that the dust had settled, he sometimes found himself standing in the hotel lobby, looking at the elegant structure around him, and wondering what it all meant. It wasn't just about the hotel, it was about creating a legacy. He had fought for a place at the table, but now he was determined to make sure others had that same opportunity. One evening, as Jason stood by the grand windows of the hotel, overlooking the city he had helped shape, he realized something profound. The hotel, in all its grandeur, was just a building. It was the people, the community, the culture, and the opportunities that made it truly valuable. His success wasn't just about owning a piece of real estate, it was about owning the change he had helped bring to the city. Jason's legacy wouldn't be defined by the money he had made or the luxury of the hotel. It would be defined by how he had turned an institution that had once rejected him into a symbol of opportunity, inclusion, and progress. The city had changed, and Jason had been the catalyst. But there was still work to do. Jason knew that his victory wasn't an end, but a beginning. The challenges of systemic inequality, of racism, and of exclusion were far from over. His work had only begun. The hotel was just the first step in a larger movement, one that would see other institutions, other businesses, and other sectors adopt the same principles of equity, opportunity, and inclusion. He had built something important, but he was far from finished. Jason stood there for a moment, feeling a deep sense of pride and accomplishment, but also a quiet determination that the fight for true equality was ongoing. His victory had been hard-earned, but he knew that it was just the start of a much bigger journey, one that would forever alter the landscape of the city, and perhaps, the world. As Jason gazed out across the city that had witnessed his rise and struggle, a feeling of quiet satisfaction washed over him. He had accomplished what many thought was impossible. Not only had he reclaimed the hotel that had once rejected him, but he had transformed it into something meaningful. It was now a symbol of what could be achieved when you dared to challenge the status quo. But while the hotel had become a place of opportunity and transformation, Jason knew that the real test was not in the recognition of his success, but in its long-term impact. The work had only just begun, and he had no intention of stopping here. The city had begun to change, but it was still a city steeped in tradition, with old systems of power deeply embedded in its fabric. Jason wasn't naive. He knew that one hotel, no matter how successful or inclusive, wouldn't dismantle years of entrenched inequality. But the ripple effect of his actions was already being felt. He had given hope to those who had long been overlooked, and in doing so, had shown the world that one person could make a monumental difference. Still, with this newfound responsibility, came an overwhelming realization: Jason wasn't just a businessman anymore. He had become a leader of something far greater than a hotel. He had become a voice for the voiceless, a beacon for those seeking change, and a catalyst for systemic reform. Jason's journey had not been easy, and the people closest to him knew it. His family, friends, and mentors had seen him struggle through the darkest moments of self-doubt, the endless hours of work, and the loneliness of being an outsider in the very spaces he now sought to transform. But in all his battles, Jason had learned one thing above all: success was not just about achieving personal goals, it was about creating opportunities for others to achieve theirs. It was about forging pathways where there had once been none, about clearing the way for those who came after him. As the hotel began to prosper, Jason turned his attention to the broader community. The city was buzzing with the energy of possibility. People from all walks of life began to look at the world through a different lens. They saw the success of the hotel not just as a victory for one man, but as a victory for everyone who had ever been held back by bias or discrimination. Jason was approached by aspiring entrepreneurs, artists, and community leaders who wanted to follow in his footsteps. He began offering mentorship programs, not only for those within the hospitality industry but across multiple sectors: business, arts, technology, and beyond. He was determined to ensure that the opportunities he had fought so hard for would be passed on to those with the vision and the drive to make their mark. Yet, despite his outward success, Jason remained deeply aware of the systemic challenges that still persisted. The city's business and political elites hadn't simply rolled over and accepted his newfound influence. Behind the scenes, whispers and undercurrents of resistance continued to churn. Those who had benefited from the old system of exclusion were watching Jason closely, waiting for him to falter. They believed that the status quo could never be truly threatened, that the powerful always found a way to regain control. They underestimated Jason, as many had before, but what they didn't realize was that he wasn't interested in playing by their rules. He had built his success on his own terms, and now he was determined to rewrite the rulebook entirely. Jason's efforts in the business community started to gather more traction. Other corporations, initially skeptical of his model, began to take notice of the way his hotel was not only thriving but changing the city's culture. Diversity was no longer seen as a political statement or a token gesture, it was becoming recognized as an essential driver of innovation and success. Jason's hotel was just the beginning. As other businesses started adopting similar practices, it became clear that the winds of change were blowing across the city. The old guard could no longer ignore the progress that was being made. It wasn't long before Jason found himself at the helm of a new initiative, the creation of an economic empowerment fund for minority-owned businesses. His vision extended beyond just his hotel, it was about creating a lasting framework for economic and social equity. He worked with city officials and community leaders to establish a fund that would provide grants, resources, and mentorship to businesses that had long been marginalized. Jason knew that for true change to take root, it wasn't enough to simply be successful himself, he had to build infrastructure that would enable others to rise as well. The initiative attracted widespread support, both from the local community and from influential business figures who had once dismissed him as a disruptor. Now, they were lining up to be part of the change. But even as the momentum behind his efforts grew, Jason still faced internal challenges. As his influence expanded, so did the expectations placed on him. There were moments when the weight of it all felt unbearable, the endless meetings, the constant pressure to deliver, and the anxiety of knowing that every decision he made had far-reaching consequences. He wasn't just representing his own business anymore, he was representing an entire movement, a vision of a more inclusive, equitable future. And the more successful he became, the more enemies he seemed to gain. Old rivals, from his days of legal battles with Maxwell Harrington to those within the city's political elite, were watching him closely. They were waiting for a misstep, a crack in the armor, something they could exploit to discredit him. But Jason was prepared for the challenges. He had been through the fire, and the lessons he had learned along the way had forged him into someone who could weather any storm. Every attempt to undermine him only fueled his resolve. He refused to let the detractors drag him down. The hotel was his symbol of resilience, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. As the years passed, Jason's vision for the city began to take shape, not just in the hotel industry but in every corner of the community. From new policies supporting small businesses to investments in education and housing, the ripple effect of his actions had begun to spark real change. Through it all, Jason never lost sight of his roots. He still visited the community centers he had supported from the beginning, listening to the stories of young people who had been given opportunities they never thought possible. And whenever he stood in the hotel's lobby, looking at the diverse faces of the people who walked through its doors, he felt an overwhelming sense of pride. His journey had come full circle. The young man who had once been turned away at the door was now the man who had opened it wide for others. But the future was still uncertain. There would be new battles to fight, new challenges to overcome. The systems of inequality Jason had worked so hard to dismantle weren't going to crumble overnight. But he had laid the foundation for change, and that was something that no one could take away from him. His legacy was not just in the hotel or the businesses he had built, it was in the hearts of the people who had been empowered by his example. Jason Harris had shown the world that it was possible to change the world, one decision at a time. And as he looked out over the city he had helped transform, he knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning.